Today we're going to be making ramen noodle dice, which has been requested for months. No, literally, Sam Waterlord, one individual, has been requesting that I do ramen noodle dice on every single video for at least 6 months. So if he's that dedicated, who am I to question what the people want? And I figured we've done ramen noodle stuff before. If you remember the resin dyeing experiments video, I made a lot of very cool things, but nobody requested more of those. You requested this horrible textured ramen noodle stuff. It still haunts my dreams, and so you can see why I've been hesitant to do it, but if we are going to do it, we're going to go big or go home and use every part of the ramen noodle package. And so, starting with the actual package, I figured if we're going to make a resin dice box for this, we might as well let the people know what flavor ramen dice these are. So I made sure you could see that beef labeling on the ramen, because obviously we don't want people to confuse this for shrimp ramen, and I cut out the label with an X-Acto knife as best I could to the lid's dimensions and said, good enough for a project that might just be a crime against nature. We're going to use a couple different molds for this project, my hexagon dice box mold, as well as my cap molds. You could use sprue molds, but a cap mold will really make it easier to put things down inside of your dice, having a lid to close it off on, so I would recommend that. I'm going to make these resin dice from Envirotech's light resin. It's a 2-part hardener and resin, and I could have told you that these dice were cursed, because as I was pouring this resin, I don't think I've ever done this before. I just basically completely missed the cup. Should have taken that as a sign that these will be cursed dice and not continued on, but my stubbornness knows no bounds. When I mix up the 2 parts of resin, you'll see that it slowly becomes very cloudy, but after about 5 minutes worth of mixing, it will become very clear. There will be no streaks in the resin, and that means you're good to go to start adding horrible things like ramen. But we're going to pour off a small bit of it to keep some of the resin clear and add the beef flavoring packet as the dye to the main part of the resin. This is your weekly reminder not to eat resin, even if it does happen to smell like delicious ramen broth. It's just not advisable, because you'll die. I only put 1 flavor packet in here because I kind of want to be able to see through. Like when I'm mixing it up here, you can see the popsicle stick inside. That's because I want to be able to see the ramen, but if you want it darker, add more flavoring packets. Never thought I'd say that. This is the most forbidden broth I have ever made. Remember that clear resin we set aside? Well, we're going to use that to put the package insert on the lid. So we're going to pour just a bit of this clear resin so that it will stick down to the lid and let it go into all corners of our lid mold here. And then we're going to actually take the ramen packaging and just try and squish it down in there. The resin will basically act like a glue, but it's very difficult to do this with your fingers. I highly recommend getting a toothpick or something small to be able to go up into all the corners and push excess resin out. You want it to be as flat to the surface of the lid as possible. That way it actually looks like it contours and is part of the lid. But then you can add your colored or flavored ramen onto the lid and let it fill up normally. Next, we'll fill up our other molds about halfway with our flavored resin. Again, don't eat or drink this. I've warned you twice now. This way we can put noodles inside of the molds and add resin on top of them to fill the molds all the way up. Now we just need to do their theme song and break me off a piece of that ramen noodle. Don't at me, Kit Kat dice makers. And luckily, because ramen noodles are so crumbly, they'll be very easy to fit down in our molds. Now we don't want to overfill these with noodles. We definitely want to overfill them with resin, but if we put too many noodles in there, it'll actually try and lift the resin off. These noodles want to float inside of the resin, so having an amount that actually kind of gets stuck on the walls in there is pretty good. We're going to do our normal cap mold thing where we overfill our dice molds. While we do that, some of the noodles are going to try and rise up and float off. If that happens, just remove them before you put the lid on. I tried to put some noodles down inside the actual body of the dice box, but because they were going to float, I only put a few in there that stuck to the walls, or else it's just going to ruin the mold. Now all we got to do is put our caps or lids on our molds. You can see the noodles tried to float to the top of the resin there, so hopefully our lids are thick or heavy enough to keep the noodles pushed down inside of the molds. I normally do a pass with a lighter to remove a lot of surface bubbles, but I don't want to risk burning any of the noodles, so I skipped that step this time and just hope the pressure pot does its job. I left the pressure pot on for 24 hours. This resin only requires a 12-hour cure, but with the noodles I wanted to be extra sure and extra careful that these would be solid when I tried to pull them out and they didn't break apart. But then I got to opening up the molds and we actually look like we have some really good looking dice here. I mean, good looking is subjective, but as I was taking the resin off some of these, I realized that, okay, these are serviceable. These look like ramen noodle dice. And as soon as I started thinking that, the curse of the ramen dice returned. The D20 and one of the D10s had giant air bubbles in them that I was going to have to fix. One of them caused by a stray noodle. But that's totally fixable and something we'll get to in just a moment. For now, let's take a look at the dice box mold, which I gotta say is looking super you get it. It does actually look really cool. It looks like broth, but the lid is where it's at. I saw this as I opened it up and I honestly started thinking, crap, am I starting to like this project that I was going in hating, because once I made this box, I was on board with this thing. We have a beef flavored ramen dice box, which is just a sentence that nobody's ever said before, and I'm glad to be the first. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, we do have some dice to fix. So I'm going to mix up another small batch of resin and add a tiny amount of the beef flavoring packet, which may turn out to be one of the cheapest by volume dyes that I can add to any resin. You can see here I'm going to drip it in slowly into those air bubbles and gaps before completely covering the lid. I want it to hit all of the gaps inside of the dice before adding all of the excess that's required for a cap mold. After curing those in the pressure pot just like before, they were good to go, and it was time to sand these dice. I'm going to get a flat surface like this glass pane and some Zona polishing papers to get us a glass-like shine on our dice. I always wet polish, and I know you want to ask, do these dice smell like ramen? No, they don't until you start sanding, and then it does kind of smell like ramen noodle soup. They are literally scratch and sniff, though I don't recommend it. And then I had to pick a color to ink the numbers in with, and I originally thought the black from the font, but then that red from the beef coloring, that just sounds perfect to me. I don't have any red that matches it, but I have two reds that I think if I combine them will give me a pretty close approximation. I ended up using about a 1-to-1 ratio of Evil Sun's Scarlet and Corn Red. I would recommend 2 of the Evil Sun's Scarlet to get a lighter red. This darkens as it dries, and I just didn't think about that because it was perfect when it was wet, but as it kind of sits there, it will darken like most paint, and I just didn't think about that. So I inked it in, wiped it off with my finger to get a pretty good look at what these are going to look like, and I was very happy. So I went ahead and inked the rest of the dice, and I used some alcohol on a paper towel to wipe off any of the excess red, and we had our completed ramen noodle dice. I am so upset and yet happy at the same time that I ended up liking this as a project. The noodles look so good, and it's so easy to see them, and all of the flavor inside of them is awesome. The numbering is pretty darn close to spot on, if not just a little bit darker, but without the absence of a direct comparison, you're not even going to notice. This looks like beef red flavoring on all the numbers. You can see all of the noodles so clearly, and they all kind of follow the shape of the dice. Now, one thing that did happen, one of the noodles on the D8 here kind of sticks up and out of the mold. I'm going to keep it. It reminds me of that absolute horrible texture, and if you're saying, well, that's going to make the dice wobbly and uneven and unbalanced, you can make your own ramen dice, because I like these. And the D12 is my favorite because of that little green onion you can see there. It adds a nice pop of color to all of these dice, though objectively the D6 is probably the best die of the set because it does still have a dried green onion in there, and you can see the noodles so well and still see the color from the flavored die. Including the box, this truly makes a soup set of ramen noodle soup dice. Now, they're not perfect. The D8 has that noodle that sticks up on the 7, and the lid has one corner where the label didn't make it all the way to the edge. But honestly, I think making ramen noodle dice perfect would be a disservice to them, because let me tell you, they sound awesome on the table. And truly, sometimes a dice tray isn't the way to go. Sometimes you need a dice bowl, and I happen to have one.
No. No. That means these are good dice.
Well, you heard it here first, and you heard it here live. I guess the curse is broken. You just got to give yourself over to the 20-cent ramen noodle packet, and it'll do wonderful things for you, like give you crits on your dice rolls. So I guess I got to actually use these dice instead of just leaving them on the shelf now. So huge thank you to Sam Waterlord for continually requesting that I make these dice, and I look forward to seeing what your new request will be for the next couple years. So subscribe so you don't miss what that might be, and everyone let me know in the comments down below on this video and every other video that I do for the next 6 months what other dice you might like to see. Like this video if you like it, dislike it if you disliked it. I want to hear that too, and either way, I hope that you have a fantastic day.